Okay, so yes, hello everybody. It's lovely to be here with you today, and thank you so much to Crella and Cambridge for hosting this symposium as a follow-up event to LTRC earlier this year and creating a space for this panel to come together again. I'm also grateful as well to the other panel members for their talks and sharing their incredible work, as I personally feel this is such a complex and important subject. And we should continue to talk openly and to discuss our difficult challenges, especially in order to improve our assessment and the test experience for our stakeholders. So I'm Gemma. I currently work for IDP Education and Speak Now. I manage test content creation. Previously, I was working for the British Council as the Test Quality Assurance Manager for APTIS and other British Council assessments. And I'll be speaking today a little bit about a project I led last year while I was there. So let's talk a bit more about inclusive test design and policy. And specifically today, I'll be talking about EDI compliant content for young learners. So this, let's go back. All right, I have an overzealous mouse. Okay, so another example of an inclusion guide. If you want, you can scan the QR code to look at this inclusion policy. It's guidelines for test content creation that I helped to develop at the British Council, and I'll be talking about this today. It has many practical tips for test content creation that can be applied to both standardized assessment and classroom content. The policy was born from a formal EDI review that I conducted in 2020 while I worked for the British Council, and I did this review with Dr. Elena Rossi, who was hired as an expert consultant for the project. And in effect, the review was to observe and record any presence of bias, stereotypes, and to observe any lack of diversity. So Elena and I took a thorough look at a large amount of the APTIS General Test item bank, including all the components, speaking, writing, reading, listening, and grammar and vocabulary. And we made observations, writing up quite a long report. The review and resulting report focused on future improvements, though. So as Elena Rossi is an expert in item writing and item writer training, my background before working for the British Council as well lied in item writer training and English test production. We both had this intention in mind. Rather than being the police of the test production team and of the content and writing up a report that nobody would read, we actually wanted to create something useful and practical, and specifically a set of hands-on guidelines for the item writers based on the findings of this review. So within the guide, you can see that the guidance is organized by types of test content, such as audio, text, and images. And the guidance also considers these three umbrella categories that you can see on the slide here: group representation, privilege, balance, and sociocultural inclusion. This guide is actually meant to be applicable to any context and any test, so it's not specific to APTIS. So it would be great if it is helpful for you if you're looking to create or adopt a policy or guide of for your own learning or test content creation or selection. So I'll be talking today just about a little section of the policy that's specific to young learners, and I'll give the QR code again at the end in case you missed it just now. So why did we add this new section to the policy? And why did we think we needed a section for young learners? This was because we started working with an external supplier to create content. We reviewed the content, it came back with some issues, even though the supplier had been given our previous version of the EDI policy and other guidance. They hadn't actually been given explicit guidance for young learners that had also been formalized by us internally. So who was involved in this project? I worked closely with Christina Gandred, who was the test production manager of the primary English test, the young learners test at the time. And we put together a plan. We organized a panel and created the section, which went through multiple feedback rounds with many colleagues before sign off. Many colleagues actually volunteered to take part in this project to create this new section. And we were very pleased because it was completely voluntary. People were very enthusiastic actually and wanted to be involved. So How did we do this? First, we held a brainstorming meeting with the first panel to talk through general and specific ideas about how to ensure fairness, create safety, and handle sensitive topics carefully for young learners for both the test content and also test delivery. And while we found a lot of the discussion to feel a bit like common sense, there were loads of really great points raised that many of us hadn't considered. And I took a lot of notes during this brainstorming meeting, around 12 pages, I think, and all by hand because there weren't AI agents coming to meetings back then. So I rewrote those notes into a shorter draft of around 3 pages, and worked on that with Christina. Then we sent the draft round to the second panel of people, along with the existing EDI test content policy, and asked for their comments. We asked them to write notes, questions before the meeting to bring them to the second meeting. And in the second meeting, we used the British Council EDI Mainstreaming tool, which is a great tool with very structured questions considering different groups who could be affected in different ways. Although, just as a side note, this may have been the last time the EDI mainstreaming tool was used for an assessment project to the British Council, because this project also jump-started another project to create an assessment-specific tool that I developed early this year with Dr. Damon Young before I left the British Council. So if you want to discuss that tool or have a link, please just send me an email, as that's online as well. So back to the topic. So the second panel meeting raised a lot of points about the existing policy that fed into the newest edition, and of course the young learners section. And I also asked a colleague, we were quite lucky, there was a colleague at the time doing her MA at Lancaster, focusing on young learners and the primary English test. So I asked her if she wouldn't mind writing up a research-based draft introduction for the section. So then the section became about 4 pages. So the section has 4 parts. First, the literature review, background and rationale, then a section on platform functionality, especially considering motivation and attention of young learners. Then it gets into topics and vocabulary with TURNIPS, which I'll talk about in a bit. And the last part is about positive representation and role modeling. So a lot of our discussion in the brainstorming and mainstreaming guide meetings was around the platform functionality and related to the motivation and attention of young learners specifically, that we weren't expecting this to come up, but actually was very important to consider. So some tips that came up, consider the test length and timing of the tasks and how these are communicated to the young learners. This, of course, can vary widely depending on their age, as a 7-year-old will likely need a very different experience to a 12-year-old. You can consider and also trial counters that might count upwards rather than downwards to decrease the stress and urgency. And also consider that attention spans may have affected young learners differently during the COVID years. So another idea that came up was to use a test completion line. Secondly, prompting, which is actually a great accommodation that has been approved for cases of ADHD and learning disabilities in my work experience. So this can be used to keep engagement and to also provide encouragement. Cues should be worded in a positive way rather than a more professional way that an adult might prefer. And confirming whether answers are right, wrong may also discourage young learners. Then instructions. They should be given orally in writing, but I think probably most on this call would agree that this is also good practice for adults. And finally, test designers of computer-based tests for young learners should consider that many young learners have grown up with the internet, lots of games, lots of applications, and are very tech-savvy already. So their expectations of test design, especially if it's gamified, they could be quite high. So if the interface is considered out of date, young learners may actually lose motivation and disengage due to their inner critic and judge. So let's move on. So I'm not going to ask for a raise of hands because I won't be able to see them, but I will just ask you if you've heard of parsnips, and I'm sure a lot of you have. So of course, parsnips is an acronym used widely. Oh, I got some thumbs up. Great, thank you. used widely in education to represent common topics that are typically avoided, loads of thumbs, thank you, when creating or choosing language learning and testing content. So loads of notes coming from the brainstorming meeting. I thought, well, what kind of acronym can we come up for young learners? So this from this was born TURNIPS. So this is threat, unfairness, responsibility, negligence, inequality, profanity, and self-consciousness. And very, very likely a lot of these are very relevant for adults as well. So maybe you can take this acronym back to work with you. I will just give you a little glimpse of the TURNIPS page. I won't read it all to you, don't worry, but I will just focus in for a moment on negligence or neglect. So considering content choice, especially when creating a situation of danger or conflict for a child. We all grew up, probably most of us grew up with Disney, but we are now seeing a shift in children's movies and TV series to reflect more positive role models and also realistic scenarios. And in the content we got back from the external supplier, we were actually quite surprised that some of these scenarios, while they did call for an element of danger and conflict, actually they weren't completely appropriate. A child walking alone on a frozen lake or taking medication by themselves for a headache. These aren't behaviors that should be encouraged, and safeguarding children is of the utmost importance in any learning environment. So the content that they read, watch, or listen to should reflect our values. And the final part of the section is on representation and role modeling, which is tied very closely, of course, to the previous section about topics and vocabulary. So this part speaks specifically to the characters in the stories, how they're named, which ethnicity they represent, and which cultures they reflect, as well as their positions and their gender roles. This section also recommends using a range of global English accents for audios, as does the main policy, where you can see a large section dedicated to this subject, and also representing people with physical disabilities as empowered individuals. So, of course, there's a lot of crossover with the previous talks, which is, I think, a very positive thing. Finally, we really have to consider role models for young learners within our stories and our content as individuals, but also as communities, without upholding one over another and being more conscious to not reflect a Western or Anglo-centric lifestyle as more important or as more standard. So, what did we learn from this? External suppliers definitely need clear guidance and ongoing support, and we can't expect common sense or even a consistent understanding of young learners' needs. It must be made explicit. Secondly, documentation must have best practice can-do guidance as well as specific can't-dos. And thirdly, if you can, include as many people as possible while developing your own documentation. We did find the teaching colleagues, as well as the colleagues who were parents themselves, to have incredible insights and not just assessment specialists, real world expertise. That was a slip of the tongue, but actually it works. Real world expertise is experience, and experience really is expertise. So I do want to just say thank you to all the British Council colleagues who volunteered to be part of the project, especially Christina and Anita, who wrote the literature review. And thank you to everybody here today. There's the QR code if you want to grab the policy, and I'm open to your questions.
Thank you very much, Gemma. A lot of applause. Very, very interesting talk. So starting with picking up on something that you said in your final slide about the diversity of the panel, the people who inputted into the expansion of the policy. Did you consider children, young, the young learners that the policy is for? So did they input into any of these decisions, I wonder?
Well, as part of the project that I led, no, but the actual test that inspired this actually was piloted with children. Interestingly, they all really enjoyed it. So I don't think that's what I kept hearing from all the feedback. But this is one, of course, one test in particular. So, and it was also after we had been very careful to review the content and to make sure we thought it was fit for them. But it's a really good point that you've raised here. That maybe they need a specific example to get them talking, you know? So maybe a discussion like this, it might be a bit tricky, but why not? Not in this case, though, no.
Because it's really about drawing insights from all the stakeholders in any assessment context, and in this case, it is young people. But that, of course, is more challenging, as you say. But there could be a way to bring their perspectives in, so we have their thoughts considered in the policy. And there's also a question about sharing the policy itself, especially the TURNIPS approach. But you have a QR code here, so hopefully the people who asked that question can scan the QR code and get that policy. And just one more final question before we move on to Linda. What have you learned, or what has been happening with the implementation of the policy? Have you had any feedback from the item writers? How are they reacting to this now that it has become part of their brief in developing those tests?
A really good question for any British Council colleagues on the call. I'm sorry, as I left earlier this year, I can't answer it.
Sorry, it's an unfair question for me. So yes, maybe we can just yes, we can hear from British Council colleagues.
Maybe it can be answered in the chat, but
or at another event, because there's so much more we can talk about. So hopefully this is the springboard for another symposium later.
I hope so.
Thank you so much, Gemma, for this very, very interesting presentation.